Please welcome up Michal Migurski.
This needs to be plugged in. Hi, everyone. My name is Michal Migurski. I'm with Stamen Design, and I'm just going to wait half a second here for my slides to get plugged in. There we go. So as I said, I'm with a small boutique design firm in San Francisco called Stamen, and we focus on data visualization and map making, basically on the internet. And it's been a personal interest of mine with my girlfriend, Jem, to think about historical maps and old maps and paper maps and how those can be brought digitally onto the internet. And so this talk is about buying maps from the flea market and putting them online. I like to think of it in terms of rescuing these maps, kind of using open software, open techniques to publish these things that have been sort of moldering in cardboard boxes and hiding away in online map collections, to put them into a format that can exist kind of in parallel with Google Maps and OpenStreetMap and other sort of geo-rectified and geo-located maps online. A lot of the interest in this project came via the city that I live in, just north of here, called Oakland. And I've been kind of collecting a lot of these kind of historical materials and placing them into the same geo-rectified context as Google Maps. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second. The first thing that I found online in the California archive is this 1877 real estate map of Oakland. And it sort of interested me largely because it really shows kind of concerns and geography over time in a city like Oakland. Oakland was founded, I believe, in the 1860s or so. And so for an 1877 real estate map, the concern is really taking this sort of raw territory and dividing it up. So here you have the western part of the city, West Oakland. Just north of the boundary of this map is the current location of the Bay Bridge. But what you have here is the old coastline and these kind of real estate parcels that are being pushed out into the water. The concern here is basically, where are you going to do landfill? Where are you going to extract some value from this rough territory? As we move forward in time, we get to 1912. This is a map from a company called the Realty Union, which was an extremely well-known real estate company in Oakland in the early part of the 20th century, run by a guy named Borak Smith, who was doing this kind of typical business pincer movement at the time, where he was running a streetcar system and doing real estate at the same time. The idea was that you'd build a streetcar and then you'd stick some sort of housing development at the end of it. So it was in their interest to publish these maps that would show something of the density of streetcar involvement. This is something that we found personally very interesting, largely because none of these street lines exist anymore. Borak Smith started something called the Key Route, which is sort of a really high-quality streetcar system throughout Oakland, and it survived up until about the 50s or 60s. And, in 1912, it was a major attraction, but if you move into a 1936 Shell oil map, you can see that even though all of these different local trains still existed around that time and still served a lot of people, the rail network wasn't something that the Shell oil people were interested in. So as you move through time and you look at these maps created by kind of different points of view and different actors, you can see that there's sort of different foreground and different background in these things. All of those train stations or all of these train routes in the previous maps still exist at this time, but they're simply omitted from the map because they're not interested. Presumably what Shell Oil is interested in is what is shown in this 1967 Chevron map, which begins to show the kind of encroachment of freeways into West Oakland. That vertical line there, the 17, is the Cypress structure, which you may remember from the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake that hit San Francisco about 20 years ago or so. This thing was kind of widely reviled for having cut that neighborhood in half. And after it was basically dismantled by an earthquake, the local neighborhood activists got together and said, actually, we'd really prefer it if you didn't put that back where it was. And instead, they worked with the Union Pacific Railroad and found another route around the neighborhood that didn't bisect it. And so now you have small, cute little twee eateries in that spot instead of a big, ugly freeway and container shipping. The other half of the interest here, beyond the historical, is also the kind of tools and process that drive this stuff. It's very simple stuff. Basically, it's a scanner, like a regular photo scanner. It's Photoshop. It's getlatlon.com, which is Simon Willison's site that basically just lets you pan Google Maps around and figure out exactly what the latitude and longitude of each position is. And it's GDAL, or GUDAL, which is the Geodata Abstraction Library. So basically what you do is you buy a map, like this one. You do a process called rubber sheeting. This is an interface that I built for myself where you've got kind of points and dots on the left and right side. There's a historical map on the left, and then there's a current Microsoft Virtual Earth map on the right, and you're basically setting up a correspondence from point to point. So you say, like, this island, this intersection, this road, this freeway, and then what you do is you project it, and then a miracle happens. You basically end up, you start with this kind of rectangular paper map, and then what you end up with is something that's been sort of twisted and warped and rubber sheeted to fit the actual geography of the underlying space. So all those maps that I was showing a few minutes ago of Oakland are all geo-rectified, and they're all positioned. So you can zoom in, and you can look at a particular intersection, and you can page back and forth in time and kind of dive through and under and out of that intersection and see exactly what was there over time, instead of the typical sort of previous way, which is, you have a paper map and another paper map, or maybe like 2 JPEGs or something, and you have to kind of trace in your head where things are. So I'm going to go through a bunch of other projects that have been popping up online kind of in the same area over the course of the past year or two. It's been sort of heartening to see that other people are interested in historical mapping in a lot of these same ways. So I'm going to start with Los Angeles. This is a project by Cartifact in Los Angeles, and I believe one of their designers and developers actually spoke here earlier this week. And what they've been doing is creating kind of an interface that they're calling the map lens. So they have their own cartography of Los Angeles, but then what you can do is you can introduce this kind of lens-like interface that pops in front of the map and offers different ways of like peering through this window into the area below it. So here you might see the same map, but maybe you can switch to a 1981 US Geological Survey map of that same area. You can switch to a 1928 map. You can move back to the late 19th century, and then you can kind of move it around the map and page back and forth. So it's a really interesting way to essentially give yourself like laser superpower vision goggles and peer through these maps and look at the history that's underneath them. It's a really lovely project. Page back, etc. This is something that I saw just recently come out of the Interactive Telecommunications program at NYU. It's a guy named Martin Sepperly, who I believe did this as his master's thesis project. It's called the Old Map app. I don't believe it's currently available in the Apple iPhone store yet, but essentially what he's been doing is geo-rectifying maps of New York kind of in the same way that I was describing with Oakland and putting them into this sort of iPhone context. So this is basically same deal, except, it's in your pocket. You can actually use this thing and page back and forth through time. So what just happened there was he zoomed into a particular area and then showed how the geo-rectification enables you to compare the present day and the previous day. This map happens to be from 1821. You can look at ones from the 19th century, the 20th century. It's basically like a time browser. UCLA has something called the Hyper Cities Project. I'm going to focus solely on Berlin, but they've also got these kind of maps for New York, for Los Angeles, for a few other places in the world. But Berlin is especially interesting, largely because it's gone through so many kind of tumultuous experiences throughout its lifetime. So they start with a map from 1237 of Berlin, which, as you can imagine, is a very kind of high-level overview. This is sort of a zoom-in. Presumably the houses and the churches weren't precisely located in those places, but it shows how the changing role of mapping over time kind of goes from this very schematic high-level view to something that by the 17th century might be a little bit more specific. So here you've got just the middle part of Berlin, currently called Mitte, which at that time was actually a walled city, and it can all fit on this one sort of small map. As you move forward into the next century, you still see those walls, but at this point the city has kind of started to spill outside of its boundaries. So you have to create a bigger map to show this stuff. The boundaries are moving beyond this frame. You can move forward in time and the city walls sort of lose their importance and fall away until you get to just barely any wall left in the 19th century. And then in the late 19th century, really all that's left is a little bit of a moat kind of pulling off the river there. So moving forward to the 20th century, you can see that the city has really integrated itself into the surrounding countryside. This is post-war, and then this is really post-war. So you can imagine, which side of the Berlin Wall made this map. You can see that, like the West Berliners basically like mapped their bit, and then, they didn't really know what was on the other side, or weren't interested, or because you couldn't get there, it was irrelevant to the map. And then moving through the 60s and 70s, you can see that maps kind of start to grow little bits of East Berlin back onto them. I'm not sure whether this was based on an aerial survey or if it was based on kind of pre-war historical stuff. But as you move forward through time, getting closer to reunification, what you can see is that these maps of Berlin start to become more visually unified as the people kind of desire to become more politically unified, until you get to 2003, where it's one city again. I think the reason why this stuff is personally interesting to me is because it allows you to ask a number of different kinds of questions of the maps that you see. You know, what is this feature? Who does it belong to? Why is it here now? What was here before? There's a project coming out of UC Berkeley right now called the Living New Deal Project that I'm finding personally interesting in this way, run by a fellow named Gray Brecken, who's a New Deal historian. He sort of jokes that, 3 years ago when he got into this stuff, the New Deal was considered this weird, esoteric 1930s thing, and now suddenly it's like current and in the news, and people are contacting him and wondering, so the New Deal, like, what's the story with that? Is that going to happen? So what he's been doing is he's been looking at historical sites of New Deal works, walls, stone ranger stations at parks, post offices, murals in schools, and so on, and mapping these things because they were never properly cataloged back in the 30s and 40s. Essentially, the New Deal, the WPA, all of these government programs funded this stuff, didn't particularly care to keep track of it, and then essentially just let it go. But it was all built to such a high standard of quality and such a high level of workmanship that it exists now, and you can kind of peel back vines and look through the history books and actually map this stuff. So they've got a site where they're constantly like talking to local historians and talking to mayors of small towns and figuring out where all this stuff went and cataloging it and hopefully figuring out who the workmen were on these pieces. There's also another firm called Sanborn Company, which back at the turn of the century was primarily interested in fire insurance maps. These ones are really lovely. This is of San Francisco in an area in the Mission District kind of close to our office. And what I find really interesting about these ones, I haven't necessarily tried to geo-rectify them yet, but they're interesting for the high level of detail that's going on here. These are fire insurance maps, so you can imagine that at the turn of the century, the interest that the fire insurance people have is, is it a wooden building? Are there gas lines? Is this thing going to kind of melt down, or is it going to contain a fire? So they have these outrageously detailed maps of entire cities that essentially show you exactly, like where the latrine is and whether there's copper pipes under the street and, where the horseshoe place is, and essentially like list every single business that's in these places. This is not local search. This is not like pizza places near the conference hotel. This is, the relevance of the kind of materials and activities that happens inside these places. And the detail is outrageous. They have these things for entire cities, published in these sort of paper indexes where you can really dig deep. The place where this ties into current work that Stamen is doing, as I said, we do data visualization, online mapping, is in a particular project that we're doing for the London Organizing Committee of the Olympic Games. They're going to be hosting the Summer Olympics there in 2012, and they contacted us to do all of their online mapping work. They have these absurd branding requirements, which, number one, prevent them from using Google Maps, for example, because Google is not a sponsor of the games, and at the same time, they have this visual identity, which personally I think is just lovely. I think that these purples and yellows are just like jarring and crazy and acidic, and I think I'm one of the few people in the world that really fell in love with this the first time that I saw it. But what we've got is we've got this interactive map that shows all of their news postings and webcams and blog entries and summer Olympic Games training camps for high school kids and so on. All of this stuff is like relevant local information that the games want to communicate to people around the UK in order to bring people from the entire country into this process. But at the same time, we were thinking about the base maps below this thing. Number one, we couldn't use Google Maps, so we knew that we had to develop our own thing. Number two, their style guide essentially mandated the use of like purple and magenta and yellow and orange, so we had that kind of color scheme to work with. And at the same time, it's not just a games event, but it's also this massive construction project. So there's this huge chunk of town in the lower Lee Valley in the east of London that's basically under heavy construction right now. There's no current geodata for this stuff because it's basically being kind of rewritten and rebuilt over time. So they started providing us with these approximately 6-month spaced out flyovers and aerial photographs of the area, and we decided to fold that into the base map. So this is what it looked like in August of 2007 when we first started working on the project. Moving into May of 2008, you can see the Olympic Stadium starts to take shape there in the upper center. You've got kind of an interesting collision here where these blue lines came from the mapping provider that we were using for the vector data, but of course, because they're not allowed into the construction site, it means that they still think that there's a river there, where obviously the ODA, the Olympic Delivery Authority that builds the stuff, has already filled the river in. And now as you move into October of 2008, you can see that the Stadium Bowl is mostly built. A lot of the other venues are starting to come in. We're kind of hoping to see another one of these aerial photos sometime soon, because this one is starting to feel a bit out of date. So to sum up, I'm really interested in seeing maps get rescued in this way, get sort of taken from like the paper ghetto and the flea market ghetto, scanned, and then put into this kind of Google-style virtual Earth tile format that lets people kind of page back and forth through time and see how this stuff exists and what kind of things happened and ownership and people and places, basically, in the same geolocation on the planet. Thank you.